Afghanistan's capital falls quickly to the Taliban, creating chaos and concern for those desperate to leave the country and criticism for its execution.
I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end. While it's been hard and messy, and yes, far from perfect, I've honored that commitment.
A first-person account of America's messy departure from Afghanistan and its impact on those left behind. Next, on the inside story, the fall of Kabul. I'm Catherine Gibson, VOA's congressional correspondent. The fall of Afghanistan happened quicker than most U.S. officials anticipated and publicly stated. And that created an atmosphere of chaos and desperation in Kabul, captured by these incredible images from the week. U.S. forces have been sent back into Afghanistan to secure the airport and evacuate tens of thousands of people. But they will not be staying long. The United States' longest war ending in fear and chaos as the Taliban overtook Afghanistan's capital city, prompting an evacuation of personnel from the U.S. Embassy and dangerous last measures by Afghans desperate to leave the country. Despite those scenes, the President of the United States said he stood behind his decision to withdraw U.S. troops.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves.
Republicans and some Democratic lawmakers swiftly condemned Biden for failing to anticipate the speed of the Afghan government's collapse and the potential damage to U.S. credibility worldwide.
This will be a permanent scar on the Biden administration's presidency. That doesn't mean it'll be a failed presidency. It doesn't mean that in the end, most people won't come to accept the fact that withdrawal, it's my view, withdrawal was not only inevitable, it was the right decision.
As the Taliban takes over governance of Afghanistan, analysts say the U.S. still has economic leverage in a country that is dependent on international assistance, as well as traditional counterterrorism operations.
Our options now include making sure the Taliban understand that if they get in cahoots with al-Qaeda or ISIS, or if they even indulge the worst of their own misogynistic and sectarian behavior and retaliate severely with violence against other Afghans, that we have options. We have military options to make them pay a price.
But the State Department confirmed Monday the U.S. no longer had a presence at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, and the Pentagon said 2,500 U.S. troops were supporting efforts at the airport to evacuate personnel, including thousands of Afghan allies who helped the United States but are still awaiting U.S. visas to escape Afghanistan and almost certain torture and death at the hands of the Taliban.
The U.S. military remains focused on the present mission to facilitate the safe evacuation of U.S. citizens, SIVs, and Afghans at risk, to get these personnel out of Afghanistan as quickly and as safely as possible.
An uncertain end to a war that cost the U.S. trillions of dollars and often lacked a clear definition for victory.
I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United States, of doubling down on a civil war in a foreign country, of attempting to remake a country through the endless military deployments of U.S. forces.
Since 2001, 4 U.S. presidents, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, have struggled to end the influence of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Biden said he would not hand over the United States' longest ever conflict to a 5th commander-in-chief. America's war in Afghanistan began after the terrorist attacks in New York and Washington on September 11, 2001. U.S. forces drove out the Taliban that harbored the al-Qaeda terrorists. 20 years later, U.S. troops are leaving, and the Taliban are back in power. What is America's legacy? Here is VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent, Cindy Sain.
On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 American jetliners, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 into a Pennsylvania field. A total of 2,997 people were killed. Then U.S. President George W. Bush was quick to respond.
I can hear you! I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Bush ordered the bombing of al-Qaeda training facilities in Afghanistan, and a combination of U.S. air power and Afghan tribal alliances ousted the Taliban regime within weeks. Kabul residents danced in the streets, and men shaved off their beards, which were then required by the Taliban. Bush decided to invade Iraq and to widen the mission in Afghanistan, seeking to rebuild the country in the model of an American-style democracy. U.S. troops and aid workers helped rebuild Afghanistan, focusing on empowering girls and women who were not allowed to attend school or work outside the home under Taliban rule. But the Taliban quickly regrouped and began their years of armed resistance, including suicide attacks on Afghan civilians. Some experts say the unclear U.S. goals from the start in Afghanistan may have been the original sin in America's 20-year involvement.
President Bush at the time felt compelled to leave Afghanistan better than he found it. And while he certainly wouldn't call it nation building, was willing to engage in some degree of that in order to try and, again, make Afghanistan a better place than it was before. But his Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, absolutely wanted to just get the U.S. military out of Afghanistan as quickly as he possibly could. And that tension really had a lot of deleterious effects early on in the U.S. presence in Afghanistan that arguably the U.S. Mission there never recovered from.
In 2009, then President Barack Obama surged troops and contractors into the country in his first term, pushing the U.S. presence to more than 100,000 before announcing a drawdown years later that left a force of about 1/10 of that size.
For many of you, this will be your last tour in Afghanistan.
Obama's successor, former President Donald Trump, vowed to bring U.S. troops home from forever wars and had his top officials sign a peace deal with the Taliban in February 2020 to withdraw U.S. troops in 14 months. But after Bush, Obama, and Trump presided over the war, it is current U.S. President Joe Biden who is ending U.S. involvement. Defending the chaotic U.S. departure this week, Biden said the U.S. accomplished its goals in Afghanistan many years ago when it pushed the Taliban from power and killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in Pakistan.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been, preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
But for Afghans, both at home and abroad, emotions are raw after the rapid Taliban takeover of the country and amid images of Americans and other foreigners fleeing Kabul. Norak Nasimi is the founder of a charitable organization that helps Afghan refugees in London.
You have to understand that building a nation, building a democracy is not a matter of time for 20 years. This is a long-term, a long-term solution, a long-term. There is a long-term commitment should be made by the U.S. and the international community. Afghanistan just have the opportunity of the NATO intervention in 2001, but 20 years is not enough to build a better future for the people.
Professor Samar Ali tells VOA how Afghans view America over the long term depends on what happens next.
I think that the past week and the past several days have been incredibly damaging. I think that the trust has eroded between us in very serious ways. And one of the things that we must immediately do is cut the red tape around accepting Afghan refugees.
The rapid collapse of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan is likely to force Washington to think long and hard about sending troops abroad in the future, says Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group.
The legacy of the past 20 years will be a United States that is much, much, much more reluctant to engage in military-led nation-building exercises anywhere around the world.
Other experts say they see a short-term blow to U.S. credibility after troops leave Afghanistan, but add it is too soon to know whether there will be lasting damage to critical U.S. alliances. Cindy Sain, VOA News.
Criticism of President Biden from many in the U.S. Congress and elsewhere is because he was much more optimistic about the strength of the Afghan government and its forces ever since announcing the pullout.
We'll not conduct a hasty rush to the exit. We'll do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely. And we will do it in full coordination with our allies and partners. We'll continue to support the government of Afghanistan. We will keep providing assistance to the Afghan national defenses and security forces. And along with our partners, we have trained and equipped a standing force of over 300,000 Afghan personnel today and hundreds of thousands over the past 2 decades. And they'll continue to fight valiantly on behalf of the Afghans at great cost.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not. Because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true.
Can you please clarify what they have told you about whether that will happen or not?
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision.
I got to know some of Afghanistan's women during my time on the ground in Afghanistan in 2011, when I was there training female journalists. They wanted to talk to me about what it was like to be a journalist, reporting openly on their government and society, and working together to build a new country. I can't help but think of whether they're on the tarmac at Kabul airport now, waiting to be evacuated out of the country they wanted to help build. Now, originally, my colleague Aisha Tanzim was supposed to host this episode of The Inside Story. She insisted on coming back to Afghanistan one final time to report and host. She is safe. And before Aisha left the country, she gave us a first-person account of the rush to leave.
I'm in a safe space right now, hiding inside a colleague's house, but the last couple of days in Afghanistan have been a little harrowing. Every single night I woke up with a jolt, thinking, has there been a blast? Is it gunfire? Do I need to wake up and check? Sometimes it was just construction nearby, but just the anxiety of being in a war zone and knowing that Kabul could come under attack any day was in my subconscious, so that I would wake up sometimes in the middle of the night. And there was sporadic gunfire. That is not unusual in Afghanistan. You often hear it in the distance, sometimes in the middle of the night. Often when people are celebrating and they use fireworks, you try to figure out whether it's fireworks or gunfire. We heard Sunday that the Taliban were at the gates of the city. My colleague was at the passport office, and he called me and said they're telling everybody to rush out and go home. They're here. I was at a clinic getting a COVID-19 test for my flight. I tweeted the information, as all reporters do, and I walked back to the guest house. There was no other way. When I walked out of the clinic, it was obvious I would just have to walk back because everybody was rushing. No taxi was stopping. The cars were speeding up. Everybody was, if not running, literally jogging. You could see that they were all rushing to get somewhere. By the time I reached my guest house, which is where I stay with other journalists, it was very obvious that the Taliban were not entering the city yet. They had issued an official statement that they will stay at the gates of Kabul, that they were looking for a peaceful transfer of power. They were going to negotiate for it. Our information was that negotiations were going on both in Doha and in the power circles of Afghanistan. Very senior Afghan leaders were involved. President Ashraf Ghani, of course, but also Dr. Abdullah, who heads the High Peace Council for National Reconciliation, former President Hamid Karzai. Around the airport, though, situation was worse. The crowds were in the thousands. They were all trying to get to the airport. And when our car got closer, we could hear sporadic gunfire. We could also see, when we got close enough, that Taliban were trying to do crowd control. They were beating back people with batons, long batons, and sometimes I couldn't tell whether the sporadic gunfire was coming from Taliban trying to tell people to stay away, or whether somebody in the crowd had guns. Anyway, the situation wasn't good, and we needed to get out of there right away, which we did. So from then on, I've just been staying under the radar, but monitoring the situation both myself and I have other friends or colleagues who are out on the streets. The streets are mostly calm now, and the Taliban seem to be behaving. The unsaid or unseen part of the story is those thousands or maybe millions of people who decided to stay home and not get out because they were anxious. They did not know how Taliban would behave. One thing that I noticed on the streets of Kabul was that women were absent. Until a few days ago, you would walk out and there were lots of women on the streets of Kabul in all kinds of dresses, from a very conservative burqa to a very modern-looking jeans, long tunic, and a scarf on their head. No more. Anybody maybe 3 or 4 was the max I saw, walking on the streets, was fully covered with their faces also covered. I had also changed my attire. When I went out for the airport, I was fully covered and my head was covered and my face was covered. And the men had changed their dresses. You would usually see a lot of men on the streets of Kabul with jeans and t-shirts. But now everybody was in the local dress, which is called shalwar kameez, which is again a long tunic and loose pants. So you saw that change in Kabul overnight. And nerves are, at breaking point right now. Ethnic minorities that I have talked to in the city are not sure about their future. Hazaras are particularly worried and they think Taliban might come looking for them and kill them. Local journalists are worried. Activists are worried. Artists are worried. The Taliban have announced general amnesty. They're saying they will not go after anyone. There will be no killing, no bloodshed. It'll be a completely peaceful transfer. What people are waiting and watching is how disciplined is their force on the ground, their fighters. Will they stick to the leadership's orders or will they do their own thing, which can be anything from harassment to killing? So, from Kabul, Aisha Tanseem, VOA News.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned the world is watching as he called on the Taliban to exercise utmost restraint to protect lives. A Security Council statement called for a new government that includes the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women. It is Afghan women and children who have borne the heaviest weight of the war and fear what is to come.
We're just going to bring you these live and exclusive pictures here.
The government of Afghanistan collapsed under the weight of the Taliban's shock and awe campaign. These images from Al Jazeera show militants in the presidential palace in Kabul. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani had already fled the country. Weeks of intense fighting pushed civilians from their homes. Most of them are women and children. 5 fleeing families found refuge in this small house. Among them are 3 widows and many orphans with nowhere else to go and for whom school is no longer an option. Displaced widow Guldasta says she lost her husband and 3 sons to the fighting. She tells VOA her grandchildren now provide for the family as trash collectors in Kabul.
Look at these little kids. They're collecting paper and plastic from garbage. Is this work for little kids? What did Ashraf Ghani do for us? What did Karzai do? What did Taliban do for us? They widowed our girls. We've been here for months. No cooking, no meat, no good clothes or shoes. They're still trying to get medicine.
With the Taliban firmly in control of Afghanistan, those bringing humanitarian aid face tough choices.
We are aiming to be able to stay and deliver the assistance that is really critical right now, but also have contingency plans for if the situation continues to deteriorate, how we keep our staff, both national and internationals like myself, safe.
Human rights workers worry most about Afghan girls who under Taliban rule were not allowed to go to school and women who could not go out in public without a full body covering and male escort.
Taliban still have same attitude, same behavior, same philosophy for their own self, like that they have their own war. And it's really not possible, or it is difficult for all people of Afghanistan, I'm sure, and particularly for women and the youth.
A displaced man identifying himself as M. Omar tells VOA his family just wants a normal life.
Taliban, you have mothers and sisters like us. The government too. You have families and mothers and sisters. For God's sake, stop the fighting. For the sake of the holy book, stop the fighting. If there is no war, we can go home and work to provide for our families. We left everything behind.
These displaced Afghans say the Taliban set landmines around the homes they fled. They say their children lost limbs. With the Afghan government's collapse, these families' dreams of a life free from Taliban rule now seem as bleak as ever. Arash Arabasadi, VOA News.
That's all for now. Keep up with the latest developments in Afghanistan and elsewhere at voanews.com. And stay connected on social media at VOA News on Instagram and Facebook. Follow me on Twitter at KGYP, that's KGYP. I'm Katherine Gibson. Come back next week for the Inside Story.